They took her house, the one she had built board by board with her own hands, and left her with nothing but 2 suitcases and a lifetime of memories. What they didn't know was that somewhere, miles away, something forgotten had already been signed into her name, waiting for her to find it. At 69, Martha Callahan never imagined she would become a stranger to her own life. For 42 years, she had lived in the same modest white house at the edge of a quiet Ohio town, a place she and her husband, Robert, had built from the ground up when they were young, stubborn, and convinced that love alone could hold a roof together. And for the most part, it had. Every inch of that home carried her fingerprint. The kitchen cabinets she painted 3 times before getting the color right, the uneven porch steps Robert always promised to fix, the oak tree they planted the year their marriage nearly fell apart, but didn't. It wasn't just a house. It was proof that they had survived everything life threw at them. So when Robert died, suddenly and quietly one cold November morning, Martha didn't think about the future. She didn't think about money, paperwork, or what came next. She just focused on getting through each day without him, holding on to the one thing that still felt solid, the house. But grief has a way of blinding you to everything else, and while Martha was learning how to live alone, something else had already been set into motion. The letter arrived 6 weeks after the funeral, tucked between sympathy cards that were still arriving from people she barely remembered. At first, she thought it was another condolence note. She almost didn't open it. But something about the envelope, thicker, more formal, made her pause. Inside were legal documents, neatly printed, precise, and devastating in their simplicity. Her husband's children, 2 grown adults from a marriage long before Martha came into his life, were claiming their inheritance. Martha had met them only a handful of times over the decades. Holidays, mostly. Polite conversations, distant smiles, a relationship that never deepened but never quite broke either. She had always assumed that when the time came, things would be handled with some level of understanding, maybe even kindness. She was wrong. The house, according to the documents, was never fully transferred into joint ownership. Robert had intended to change it years ago. He'd said so more than once, but intentions don't hold up in court. Legally, the property was still his, and now it belonged to his children. They weren't interested in keeping it. They weren't interested in Martha staying. They wanted it sold. Immediately, Martha read the papers 3 times before the words made sense. Then she called them. First the daughter. No answer. Then the son. He picked up, listened quietly as Martha tried to explain how long she had lived there, what the house meant, how she had nowhere else to go. And when she finished, there was a pause. Not a sympathetic one, a calculating one. "We're not trying to be difficult," he said finally, his voice calm but distant. "It's just business. We all have our own lives, our own expenses. Selling the house is the simplest option." Simplest. The word echoed in her mind long after the call ended. For them, it was simple. For her, it was everything. Over the next few weeks, Martha did everything she could think of. She went to a lawyer, using money she could barely spare, hoping there was some loophole, some technicality that would give her time. There wasn't. She offered to buy them out. Even though her savings were modest at best, they declined. The offers on the house came quickly. Investors, mostly. People who saw the property as an opportunity, not a home. Strangers walked through her living room, opened her cabinets, measured her walls, discussing renovations as if her life wasn't still sitting in every corner. She stayed polite. She stayed quiet. But each showing felt like a piece of her was being stripped away. The day the sale was finalized, Martha stood in the kitchen long after the real estate agent had left, staring at the spot on the wall where Robert used to hang his keys. The house was already starting to feel unfamiliar, like it had begun letting her go before she was ready. She packed slowly, carefully, as if taking her time might somehow delay the inevitable. But time, like everything else, wasn't on her side. When the day came to leave, there was no dramatic farewell. No one came to see her off. She loaded her suitcases into the back of her old pickup truck, took one last look at the porch where she had spent so many evenings watching the sun go down, and closed the door behind her without locking it. It wasn't hers to lock anymore. The first few nights, she stayed in a church shelter a few towns over, a place that smelled faintly of detergent and quiet resignation. The other women there kept to themselves, each carrying their own stories, their own losses. Martha didn't talk much. She wasn't ready to explain how a life could unravel so quickly, how a home could disappear not because of fire or disaster, but because of paperwork and decisions made years ago. During the day, she tried to keep busy, sorting through the few belongings she had managed to take with her, organizing papers, holding on to anything that felt important. It was in one of those moments, sitting on a narrow cot with a cardboard box in her lap, that she found it. A folded piece of paper, tucked between old receipts and a faded photograph of her and Robert from years ago. The handwriting was his. She would have recognized it anywhere, slightly slanted, uneven in places, but unmistakably his. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it, expecting something sentimental, maybe a note he had forgotten to give her. Instead, she found just a few words, written without explanation, an address she didn't recognize, followed by a short line underneath. "Dairy's yours." Martha frowned, reading it again, trying to make sense of it. A dairy? What dairy? Robert had never owned a dairy. At least, not that she knew of. For a moment, she considered dismissing it as nothing, some half-finished thought or mistake. But something about it didn't sit right. Robert wasn't careless with his words. If he wrote something down, it meant something. And right now, with nothing left tying her to the life she had lost, even the smallest mystery felt like a thread worth pulling. She folded the note carefully, holding it a little longer than necessary, as if it might disappear if she let go. For the first time in weeks, she felt something shift. Not hope, not yet, but curiosity. And sometimes, that was enough to keep a person moving. The place she was about to find would look like nothing. Rotting wood, broken fences, and a past everyone else had already given up on. But buried somewhere inside it was the reason her husband had written those 3 quiet words. "Dairy's yours." Martha didn't expect the drive to change anything. She told herself that more than once as she followed the address scribbled on that worn piece of paper, hands tight on the steering wheel of her aging pickup, the road stretching farther than she had planned for. What started as a simple trip turned into something else entirely as highways gave way to backroads, and backroads dissolved into long, empty stretches of gravel where houses grew sparse and time seemed to move slower. She stopped twice to ask for directions, each time getting the same puzzled look when she mentioned the old dairy. Some people shrugged, others pointed vaguely ahead, and one man at a gas station simply said, "Thought that place was dead," before turning back to his coffee. By the time she reached the final turn, the sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the land. And for a moment Martha wondered if she had made a mistake coming at all. But then she saw it, the gate. Rusted, half-hanging, barely clinging to its hinges as if it had been forgotten mid-fall. Beyond it stretched a wide expanse of land that might have once been orderly, purposeful, alive, but now looked like nature had reclaimed it piece by piece. Tall grass swayed where cattle might have grazed decades ago. Fences lay broken or swallowed by weeds, and in the distance stood the skeletal remains of what had once been barns, their roofs caved in, their walls weathered to a dull gray. Martha stepped out of the truck slowly, the silence pressing in around her in a way that felt heavier than the noise of any city. No traffic, no voices, just wind, distant birds, and the faint creak of something shifting in the breeze. She walked past the gate, her shoes crunching against gravel and dry earth, each step uncertain but deliberate, until she reached what looked like the main structure, a farmhouse, or what was left of one. The porch sagged dangerously, one corner nearly collapsed, and the windows were either shattered or boarded up in a way that suggested someone had once tried to keep people out and then stopped caring. For a long moment, she simply stood there, taking it in, trying to reconcile this place with the note in her hand. "Dairy's yours." It didn't feel like hers. It didn't feel like anything that could belong to anyone anymore. It felt abandoned in the truest sense of the word, not just empty, but forgotten. And yet, something about it held her attention. Maybe it was the sheer scale of it, the land stretching farther than she could see from where she stood, or maybe it was the quiet, stubborn part of her that refused to believe Robert would leave behind something meaningless. She circled the property slowly, taking in the details others might overlook. The old fencing that, while broken, still traced the boundaries clearly. The layout of the barns suggesting a once thriving operation. The remnants of machinery scattered here and there, rusted but not entirely beyond recognition. This hadn't always been a failure. It had been something real, something that worked. The next morning, Martha drove into the nearest town, a small, aging place that looked like it had seen better decades, and went straight to the county clerk's office. The building smelled faintly of paper and time, and the woman behind the counter greeted her with a practiced politeness that didn't quite hide her curiosity. Martha explained as simply as she could, sliding the note across the counter along with the address. The clerk frowned, typed something into her computer, then paused. "Give me a minute," she said, standing and disappearing into a back room filled with filing cabinets. Martha waited, her heart beating a little faster than she expected, unsure what she was hoping to hear. When the clerk returned, she carried a thin folder, her expression now more focused than casual. "This property," she began, flipping it open, "was transferred decades ago. Not recently. This goes back at least 35, maybe 40 years. Martha leaned forward slightly, her hands tightening on the edge of the counter. "Transferred to who?" The clerk glanced down at the document, then back up at her. "To you." The word hung in the air, heavy and almost unreal. "That's not possible," Martha said quietly, more to herself than to the clerk. "I've never even heard of this place until yesterday." The clerk gave a small shrug. "Well, according to these records, it was legally signed over. No disputes filed, no claims made. Taxes haven't been paid in a long time, though." She tapped a line on the paper. "That's going to be an issue." Martha barely heard the last part. Her mind was already racing, trying to piece together something that made sense. Robert had known. He had to have known. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't forgotten paperwork. He had left this to her, intentionally. But why hadn't he told her? Why wait until now, until after everything else had been taken from her? The questions didn't have answers, at least not yet. But one thing was suddenly clear in a way it hadn't been before. She wasn't standing on someone else's land. She wasn't trespassing or chasing a dead end. That broken-down dairy, as neglected and forgotten as it looked, belonged to her. The realization didn't come with excitement or relief. It came with weight. Ownership meant responsibility. It meant the unpaid taxes the clerk had mentioned, the repairs that would take more than she had, the uncertainty of what could even be done with a place like that. Most people, Martha knew, would have walked away. They would have seen the cost, the effort, the risk, and decided it wasn't worth it. But Martha didn't have the luxury of walking away anymore. She had already lost the one place she couldn't replace. This wasn't about finding something better. It was about finding anything at all that was still hers. That afternoon, she drove back to the property with a different feeling in her chest. Not hope, not yet, but something steadier. A kind of quiet determination that had carried her through worse before. She parked near the farmhouse again, stepped out, and looked at it not as a ruin this time, but as a starting point. It wouldn't be easy. It might not even work. But standing there, with the wind moving through the tall grass and the last light of day stretching across the land, Martha made a decision that surprised even her. She wasn't leaving. Not this time. If the world had decided she didn't belong anywhere else, then she would make something out of the one place that hadn't been taken from her, no matter how broken it looked. What she was about to uncover inside that broken dairy wasn't just the reason it had been abandoned. It was the reason no one had ever come back for it, and the reason her husband had waited until the very end to leave it in her name. Martha didn't rush into anything after deciding to stay. She had learned the hard way that rushing often meant losing, and she didn't have anything left to lose again. Instead, she worked slowly, methodically, starting with the farmhouse because it was the only structure that still resembled shelter. The first few nights were rough, cold air slipping through cracked boards, the constant creak of wood settling, and the kind of silence that made every small sound feel amplified. But it was still hers, and that alone made it different from the shelter cot she had left behind. Each morning, she woke up with a purpose she hadn't felt in months, stepping outside to face the same overgrown land but seeing it a little differently each time, not as something ruined, but as something paused. She began clearing paths first, cutting through the tall grass and pulling away weeds that had claimed the walkways, revealing the original layout piece by piece like a memory returning after being buried too long. The barns were harder. One had partially collapsed, its roof caved in under years of neglect, while another still stood but leaned at an angle that made it feel like it might give up at any moment. She didn't try to fix everything at once. She focused on what could still be saved, reinforcing beams where she could, removing debris where she couldn't, slowly carving out spaces that felt usable again. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of the work began to settle into her bones. Wake up, fix something, clean something, uncover something, repeat. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't easy, but it was hers in a way nothing had been since Robert died. And then, one afternoon, while clearing out what had once been the milking shed, she found the first real sign that this place held more than just decay. Behind a row of rusted equipment, partially hidden by collapsed wooden panels, were a set of stainless steel tanks, large, industrial, and surprisingly intact. They were coated in dust, but not destroyed, not stripped for parts like everything else around them. That alone was strange. Equipment like this didn't just get left behind unless something had forced people to leave in a hurry or convinced them it wasn't worth taking. Martha ran her hand along the surface of one tank, wiping away years of grime to reveal metal that still held a faint shine beneath it. It was a small detail, but it shifted something in her thinking. This place hadn't just failed, it had been left. There was a difference. Curious now, she kept digging, clearing more of the shed until she noticed a door at the far end, almost completely obscured by stacked debris and a warped wooden beam that had fallen across it. It took her the better part of an hour to clear a path, and even then, the door didn't budge at first. The lock was still intact, rusted but holding, as if whatever was behind it had been deliberately sealed away. Martha hesitated for a moment, her hand resting on the cold metal, a strange feeling settling in her chest. Part curiosity, part caution. Then she stepped back, grabbed one of the heavier tools she had salvaged, and struck the lock hard enough to crack it loose. The sound echoed through the empty structure, sharp and final, and for a second, everything went quiet again, as if the place itself was holding its breath. She pushed the door open slowly, the hinges protesting as they moved, and stepped inside. The room was smaller than she expected, windowless, with shelves lining the walls and boxes stacked carefully from floor to ceiling. Not scattered, not abandoned, organized. That was the first thing she noticed. Whatever had been left here hadn't been left in chaos. It had been stored, preserved. She pulled one of the boxes closer and opened it, revealing neatly kept documents, old invoices, supply orders, handwritten logs detailing daily production, quantities, and notes and margins that spoke of precision and care. She opened another, then another, each one telling the same story in different pieces. This dairy hadn't been struggling in the way people had said. It hadn't been failing because it couldn't produce. If anything, it had been doing something very different from the others at the time. Smaller batches, higher quality, meticulous processes that prioritized consistency over scale. It wasn't outdated. It was ahead of its time in a way that the market back then probably didn't understand. Martha sat down on an overturned crate, a stack of papers in her lap, her mind slowly connecting dots that had been scattered for decades. This place hadn't collapsed because it was worthless. It had been abandoned because the world around it moved in a different direction, faster, cheaper, bigger, and left it behind. But the world had changed since then. People cared about quality again, about where their food came from, about how it was made. She didn't need to be an expert to see that. She just needed to pay attention. Over the next few days, she read through as much as she could, learning the rhythms of the place the way she had once learned the rhythms of her own home. What worked, what didn't, what could be brought back with the right effort. She didn't have money for big investments, didn't have the resources to rebuild everything at once, but she didn't need to. Not yet. She started smaller than small, cleaning one tank, repairing one section of fencing, reaching out to a nearby farmer about buying a single cow that might otherwise be sold off. It wasn't a business plan. It wasn't even a guarantee of success. It was just a beginning, and that was enough. Weeks later, standing at the edge of the property as the sun rose over land that no longer felt entirely abandoned, Martha realized something that hadn't been clear before. Losing her house hadn't been the end of her life. It had been the moment everything familiar was stripped away, leaving her with something she hadn't had in years, the chance to build again, not from memory, but from possibility. This dairy, broken and forgotten as it was, hadn't been given to her by accident. Robert had known about it. He had chosen not to tell her until the right moment. Maybe because he knew she wouldn't have left her old life otherwise. Or maybe because he trusted that if everything else was taken, she would find her way here. Either way, standing there now, with dirt on her hands and a future she could shape in front of her, Martha understood the truth behind those 3 simple words. There's yours. Not as a gift, not as a safety net, but as a second chance no one else had been willing to see.